What if the pain from your past was keeping you from living your true life? What if the only way to break free was to face it head on? These aren't just questions. They are the very foundation of survival. The kind of survival that doesn't just get you through the day, it changes you. It shapes you into someone unrecognizable to the world around you, yet deeply familiar to the person who has fought the hardest battles in silence. This is the story of Grandma, a woman whose name isn't just a title but a badge of honor earned through years of struggle. A woman whose journey could have been one of despair, but instead became one of strength, resilience, and transformation. Her story, like so many others, is full of twists, moments of pure agony, and those brief flickers of hope that we often let slip away, until one day we realize they are the very things we need to survive. Grandma didn't always have the peace she enjoys now. Her life was far from perfect, filled with years of challenges she never asked for, but had to face. She grew up in a world where love was hard to come by, where every day was a fight to hold on to something, anything, that would give her a sense of purpose. A life built on the foundations of pain, loss, and sacrifice, yet still, she found a way to rise above it all. In her younger years, she was the girl who believed she would never escape the clutches of her past. But she did. She learned that, sometimes, the only way to break free from the chains of your history is to confront it, and in confronting it, to make peace with the very things that once tried to tear you apart. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about reclaiming your power. It's about finding the courage to face the monsters that hide in your memories, and finally letting go. Grandma's story is a testament to that quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. The strength that says, I will not be broken. Not today, not ever. It's the story of how someone can endure unimaginable hardship and come out stronger on the other side. A story of healing, of letting go, and of growing into the person you were always meant to be. This is not just her story. It is a story for anyone who has ever wondered if they could ever truly be free from their past. It is for anyone who has ever fought through a storm, only to find that the storm had a purpose. For Grandma, the storm was not her end. It was her beginning. If you're ready to hear a story of survival, strength, and transformation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and don't miss a single moment. What comes next is something you need to hear. Grandma's story didn't begin with happiness, not the kind of joy we wish for children. Her early years were marked by a sense of isolation, a feeling that the world was too big and too unkind for someone like her to survive. Born into a family that struggled, both emotionally and financially, she quickly learned that life didn't hand out kindness. It had to be fought for. Her parents, though well-intentioned, were overwhelmed by their own hardships. Her father was a man of few words, a stern figure who worked tirelessly to provide for the family. But his presence, though constant, was cold. He rarely smiled, rarely spoke with affection, and often seemed lost in the grind of daily survival. His work on the farm, from dawn until dusk, was his escape, his way of dealing with a world that seemed to give him nothing but struggle. Her mother, on the other hand, was the opposite. Warm, caring, and always with a gentle smile, she tried to fill the gaps her husband left. But the weight of raising a family in a home that never seemed to have enough food, enough love, enough warmth, took a toll on her. Despite her best efforts, Grandma's mother often seemed too tired, too overwhelmed to give her daughter the nurturing that every child deserves. There were days when Grandma would sit by the window, watching the world outside, wondering why things were the way they were. The laughter of other children, the warmth of homes where parents seemed to have time to care, felt like something far out of reach. She lived in a house of silence, where her father's sternness overshadowed any joy her mother tried to create, and where her dreams seemed as distant as the horizon she could never touch. Poverty was a constant companion. There were days when food was scarce, and nights when the cold crept in through the thin walls of their home. Grandma and her siblings would huddle together, trying to keep warm, as their mother did her best to make do. Clothes were patched and mended over and over, and toys, if there ever were any, were made out of whatever scraps could be found. She would make dolls out of corn husks and clothes out of old rags, crafting little worlds from nothing but her imagination. But no matter how many dolls she made, or how many imaginary friends she could conjure, the world outside the window always seemed so much brighter than the one she lived in. The world of opportunity, of warmth, of freedom, was just out of her reach. The promise of something better seemed like a distant dream, one she could only hold on to by sheer force of will. At the age of 7, Grandma already understood what it meant to go without. She learned to keep her desires small, to ask for little, because she knew there was no point in asking for things that could never be had. She never asked for a birthday party or a new dress. She never asked for toys or for anyone to play with her. The quiet resignation of those early years taught her that dreaming was dangerous, because dreams, in her world, only led to disappointment. But in the darkest corners of her heart, where the light of hope hadn't been fully snuffed out, she still dreamed of escape from the grinding poverty, the endless days of struggle. She imagined a different life, one where she could feel the warmth of the sun on her face without worrying about whether there would be enough food to fill her stomach that night. A life where her father's stern face wasn't the first thing she saw in the morning, and where her mother's tired eyes didn't look at her as though she were just one more burden. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind drifting far away from the small, cold room she slept in. In her dreams, she was free. She imagined running through fields of tall grass, with no worries, no weight on her shoulders, her feet light and fast as she ran toward the horizon. She dreamed of a life where she didn't have to worry about tomorrow, where she could wake up and know that everything would be all right. But reality was never far behind. Fear was a constant shadow, the kind of fear that comes when you're too young to understand why your world is the way it is, but old enough to feel the sting of it. The fear that no matter how hard you try, you'll never escape it. The fear that the world is a place where dreams are nothing more than cruel jokes played on the innocent. At the age of 9, Grandma started to realize something terrifying. She was not in control. The decisions that shaped her life were being made by others, by forces much bigger than her. She had no say in her future. Her future was dictated by her father's moods, her mother's exhaustion, and the unforgiving poverty that boxed them in. She knew that if things didn't change, she would be stuck forever, stuck in the same life that had crushed the joy out of her parents, stuck in a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. It was then that she made a vow to herself. Though she didn't have the words to express it yet, she would escape. Even if it took years, even if it meant breaking away from everything she knew and loved. She would not live and die in the same small world that had been handed down to her. She would find a way out. But for now, she remained in that world, bound by the chains of family and circumstance. Her dream of escape would have to wait, but it would never leave her. It would be the fire that kept her moving forward, even when life seemed determined to hold her back. And so, she carried on, waiting for the day when she could finally break free. It was a cold winter day when everything changed. Grandma was just 12 when the storm hit. It wasn't a storm of rain or snow, but a storm of emotions, a wave of loss so overwhelming that it threatened to swallow everything in its path. She had heard the whispers for weeks, the quiet discussions between her parents about something being wrong, but she never understood the gravity of it. She was a child, after all, and the world of grown-up problems, illnesses, debts, strained relationships, was something far removed from her understanding. Her father had been sick for a while, a sickness that no one spoke about too openly. He was still working the fields, still doing his best to provide. But there were moments when his hands shook and his eyes seemed distant. Grandma tried to push away the worry that gnawed at her, but deep down, she felt it. Something was wrong. And then one morning, her father didn't get up. Her mother's voice, usually so soft and full of warmth, was shattered that morning. The sound of her crying broke the fragile stillness of their small house, sending ripples of panic through Grandma's chest. She rushed to her mother's side, only to find her father lying still, a blank expression on his face. He was gone, just like that. In that moment, Grandma's world crumbled. Her father had been the quiet anchor of their family. He was not affectionate, not warm, but his presence was like the earth beneath their feet, steady, dependable. His death was a sudden jolt that left everything unmoored, spinning out of control. Her mother was inconsolable, her sorrow a deep well that seemed to swallow her whole. Grandma, in her grief, had to become the caretaker. She took over the household chores, helped her mother, and tried to hold the family together, even as the weight of her own heartbreak threatened to crush her. The loss of her father was more than just the death of a man. It was the death of security, of hope. Her childhood was over. The warm, carefree days of playing with her friends and dreaming of the future were replaced with the cold, stark reality of survival. At 12 years old, she was already a caregiver, a daughter who had to step into shoes far too big for her. But it wasn't just the loss of her father that tore her apart. It was the grief of seeing her mother slowly wither away. Her mother, once a beacon of light, now seemed like a shadow of herself. She no longer hummed nursery rhymes or cooked with the same passion. The warmth in her eyes had dimmed, replaced with a vacant stare, and she barely got out of bed for days on end. Grandma tried everything she could to comfort her, but the weight of her mother's sorrow was too much to bear. Her mother was not just mourning the loss of a husband. She was mourning the loss of the dream they had built together, the hope for a better future. It was as if a part of her mother had died with him. Grandma found herself caught between two realities: her own overwhelming sorrow and the desperate need to keep the family afloat. She tried to stay strong, to be the rock her family needed, but every day felt like a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Her father's absence left an unfillable void, and though she knew she had to step up, the pressure weighed heavily on her heart. She was only a child, but she had no choice but to grow up in an instant. The pain was suffocating, but amid the grief and loss, there was something else, something that Grandma would not recognize until much later in her life. It was resilience. In the face of such devastating pain, she found an inner strength she never knew she had. She couldn't change the past, couldn't bring her father back, but she could keep going. She could take care of her mother, could push through the heartbreak, could keep the family moving forward. Her inner conflict, though, was ever present. She longed to feel the pain, to let herself break down, to scream at the unfairness of it all, but she couldn't. Not for her mother's sake, not for the sake of the family. She had to be the strong one. So she buried her pain deep inside, where it festered and grew, a silent, secret burden she would carry for years to come. She often wondered if she was even capable of being happy again. The future, once full of promise, now seemed like an endless stretch of uncertainty. Without her father's guidance, without the stability he provided, the world felt too big, too dangerous. But as the weeks and months passed, something shifted inside her. She realized that even in the depths of sorrow, there was something to hold on to. She could still fight. She could still dream of something better, something more than the life she had been dealt. And in that fight, in the constant struggle to survive, she found a flicker of hope that kept her going. Her father was gone, and her world had changed forever, but she would not let the pain define her. She would survive it, even if she didn't yet know how. And so, she began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, but it was something. Every day she took small steps forward, even when the weight of grief threatened to drag her back. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, there was one thing she knew for sure. She was strong enough to keep walking it. But in the quiet moments, when the pain would hit her hardest, she couldn't help but wonder, would she ever be free of this loss? Or would the scars of her past follow her, no matter how hard she tried to escape? The answer, she would soon learn, would come in ways she never expected. For years, Grandma carried the weight of loss, grief, and family responsibility as if they were an indelible part of her identity. She had become accustomed to the silence that hung over the house, the absence of joy that once filled every corner of their home. But even as she tried to hold everything together, something inside her had begun to stir, a quiet, nagging voice that grew louder with each passing year. It wasn't just the pain of the past. It was a deeper, more insidious feeling. The realization that the past was still holding her hostage. It was a hot summer afternoon when the turning point came. She was 18 now, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, but still very much trapped in the shadow of her childhood. The years had passed, and though she had done her best to rebuild, something was missing. She had gone through the motions, working, helping her mother, trying to keep the family afloat, but there was an emptiness that never seemed to go away. It was as if she were walking through life with her hands bound, unable to reach for anything beyond the daily struggle. And then it happened. She came face to face with the very thing she had been avoiding for so long. Her brother Stephen. Stephen had always been a difficult figure in her life. He was the one who had been distant, unkind, and at times even cruel. After their father's death, he had taken over the reins of the family's farm. But with his authority came a coldness that made everyone uncomfortable. He wasn't just the older brother anymore. He had become the patriarch, and his demands and expectations were suffocating. But the breaking point came one evening, when Stephen crossed a line that even Grandma couldn't ignore. She had been working late, cleaning up after dinner, when she heard him approaching the house. His footsteps were heavier than usual, and his voice carried the sharpness that had become so familiar over the years. He was angry. As she turned to face him, she could see it in his eyes, the simmering rage that always seemed to burn just beneath the surface. He was looking for a reason to lash out, and that evening, he found it. "You think you're better than me?" Stephen snapped, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can just escape, like everything's fine?" The words stung, but it wasn't the first time he had said something like that. She had learned to shut out the cruel words, to pretend that they didn't affect her. But tonight felt different. This time, the anger in his voice felt like a personal attack, aimed not just at her actions, but at who she was. For years, she had been the dutiful daughter, the one who took care of things, the one who kept the house running. But all the while, she had known that there was no room for her in this family dynamic. There was no room for her to be herself, to live freely, to break away from the suffocating expectations of her brother. And in that moment, something shifted. She could feel the walls inside her start to crumble. She had spent so much of her life trying to please him, trying to keep the peace. But it was clear now that nothing she did would ever be enough. The person she had tried to be, the good daughter, the hard-working sibling, was never going to be enough to satisfy Stephen's needs. He had already taken too much from her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, frozen by fear, but also by the realization that this was it, the moment that would define her future. She had to make a choice. The decision wasn't easy. Fear gripped her tightly, an invisible chain that held her in place. She was terrified of what would happen if she stood up to Stephen, terrified of the consequences. What if he became violent? What if he turned the entire family against her? The fear of abandonment and rejection still lingered, the same fears that had kept her silent for so many years. But she knew that the fear of continuing to live like this, of living under his control, of being trapped in this life, was far greater. Her future could not be tied to this man. She had spent years dreaming of escape, dreaming of freedom, but the time for dreams was over. She could no longer afford to wait for some magical moment to come and change everything. She had to take action. Her voice, trembling at first, finally broke the silence. "I'm leaving, Stephen. I can't stay here anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just thinking about escaping in her mind. She was actually doing it. Stephen's face contorted with disbelief and rage, and for a brief moment, she feared he might lash out. His fist clenched at his side, but she stood her ground. She didn't care anymore. "I'm done," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I'm not your servant, and I'm not your shadow. I'm leaving, and I'm going to live my life. You can't control me anymore." Stephen stood there, frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't find the words to respond. The air between them crackled with tension. But for the first time, Grandma felt a strange sense of peace. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. She turned away from him. But before she could take a step, Stephen's voice broke through the silence one last time. "You'll regret this." But she didn't look back. She couldn't. There was no room for regret now, only forward motion. Grandma packed what little she had, the weight of her decision settling into her chest like a stone, but it was a stone she was willing to carry. She was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time, she felt like she was in control. She had made a choice, and that choice was hers to make. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, but it no longer had the power to hold her back. She had taken the first step toward freedom, and there was no going back. The road ahead was uncertain, and she didn't know where it would lead, but one thing was certain. She was no longer a prisoner of her past. The next chapter of her life had just begun. And this time it was on her terms. The moment Grandma made the decision to leave, the weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. But that sense of relief was short-lived. The path she had chosen was far from easy. It was a journey into the unknown, a life that would demand not only physical strength but emotional resilience. The kind of strength she had never known she had, but now had no choice but to find. Leaving was not simple. Grandma didn't have the luxury of wealth or connections. She had no money of her own, no possessions beyond the few clothes she could pack into a small bag. What she had was a fierce determination, a fire that had been ignited within her in that moment of defiance. She had been waiting for this day, for this moment of clarity, her entire life. Now there was no turning back. She couldn't go back to her family. At least not under these circumstances. Her decision to leave was final. She had to find a way to live on her own, to create a life for herself that was free from the emotional and psychological chains that had bound her for so long. But freedom came with its own set of challenges. The first obstacle was leaving. She knew that Stephen would not let her go easily. He was a man who had controlled their family with a firm grip, a grip she had finally broken, but he wasn't going to accept that. As Grandma made her way to the edge of the property, her heart raced, each step filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She could feel Stephen's presence behind her, the weight of his gaze heavy on her back. The house she had lived in for so long felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her as she walked away. But there was no turning back now. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to leave. She couldn't stay there, not when every corner of the house, every room, reminded her of the man she had escaped. The road ahead was uncertain, and yet she walked it with purpose. Her second obstacle was survival. She had no money. No job, no plan. She wasn't sure where she would sleep that night, or how she would get food, but she knew she had to keep moving. The world outside the ranch seemed vast and intimidating, and the thought of being alone in it made her stomach churn. But as terrifying as it was, she felt a sense of empowerment in her independence. The unknown didn't seem so daunting anymore. It was her choice. She spent the first few days on the road, sleeping under trees or in barns, barely scraping by. Each morning was a new challenge, but it was also a new victory. She hadn't given up. She was still moving, still surviving. She didn't need anyone's approval. She was finally in control of her life. But as the days passed, her body grew tired. Hunger gnawed at her, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. It was easy to feel overwhelmed. There were moments when she wanted to quit, to curl up somewhere safe and forget about everything. The reality of what she had done, the enormity of her decision, hit her in waves. The fear of failure, of being abandoned, of having no one to rely on, crept in at night when she lay alone in the dark. She missed the familiar voices of her family, even Stephen's, though she would never admit it. But she refused to turn back. She could never go back to that life. She had to keep moving. Her first victory came when she found a place to stay, a small town a few miles down the road. It wasn't much, just a run-down bed and breakfast where the owner, an older woman with kind eyes, offered her a job cleaning. It wasn't glamorous, but it was work. For the first time in months, Grandma felt a glimmer of hope. She worked tirelessly, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, and helping the elderly woman with whatever she needed. Her hands were sore, but her heart was light. Every dollar she earned was a step toward freedom, a step toward her new life. She was building something, brick by brick, out of the nothing she had when she left. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was hers. In the evenings, after her work was done, she would sit by the fire with a cup of tea, reflecting on how far she had come. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't the helpless girl who had felt trapped in a life of silence. She was a woman who had taken control of her destiny. Her next victory came when she started to trust herself again. The fear that had ruled her for so long, the fear of failure, the fear of not being enough, began to fade. She realized that she could depend on herself, that she didn't need anyone to tell her what to do or how to live. She had been stronger than she had ever known, but there were still obstacles ahead. The scars from her past were deep, and there were moments when the pain would resurface. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would hear echoes of Stephen's voice, feel the ghost of her old life trying to pull her back. The emotional wounds were not as easy to escape as the physical ones. The battle for her own peace was ongoing, and there were days when it felt like she was losing. But even on those days, she would remind herself of the progress she had made. She would look back at how far she had come, how she had gone from being a girl who was afraid to speak her mind to a woman who was creating a future for herself. She had survived the worst, and had lived to tell the tale. As the weeks turned into months, Grandma grew stronger, more independent. She no longer saw herself as someone who was defined by her past. She had begun to define herself. This was her story now. And though the road ahead was still long, she knew she could face whatever came her way. She had taken the hardest step, leaving, and the rest of her life was now in her hands. Grandma had always been a quiet woman, one who kept her pain close to her chest, like a secret she feared to share. For most of her life, she had lived in silence, battling her demons alone, convinced that her struggles were hers alone to bear. But as the months turned into years, and as she found herself healing in ways she never thought possible, something within her began to change. She realized that her story was no longer something to hide. It was something to share. It was a warm afternoon when the idea first came to her. She had been working in her garden, the small plot of earth she had cultivated as her own space of peace and healing, when she overheard a conversation between two women from the town. They were talking about their struggles, one with the loss of a loved one, the other with an abusive relationship. Grandma, who had always kept to herself, paused for a moment, her hands still in the soil as she listened to their pain. She felt a deep empathy for them, a longing to reach out and offer the comfort she had learned to give herself. In that instant, she understood. Her pain had a purpose, and that purpose was not just her own healing. It was to help others, to show them that they too could heal. She had spent so many years buried in her own sorrow, but now she saw that her struggles could become a source of strength for others. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, or where to start, but she knew she had to begin. She had already started sharing small pieces of herself with those around her. The conversations with Mrs. Della, the quiet evenings with Mark, the stories she shared with the women who came to her for advice. Slowly, she began to open up, letting people see the woman she had become, not just the girl who had fled in fear. And with each person she spoke to, she felt the power of her words, the comfort they brought, and the healing that blossomed in others as well. The first time she shared her story in full was with a group of women at the community center. It wasn't a planned speech or a rehearsed monologue. It was simply her, sitting with a small group of women who had gathered to talk about their lives, their hardships, their dreams. As they spoke, Grandma listened, offering words of encouragement. But it wasn't until one of the women asked her, "How did you get through your pain?" that she found herself sharing. At first, the words came out haltingly, awkwardly, as though her story had been buried for so long that it didn't quite fit into the present. She spoke of her childhood, of the heavy grief that had suffocated her, and the way she had run from it, only to realize that running had only delayed the inevitable. She talked about the years spent in silence, the guilt that weighed her down, and the strength she had found within herself to break free. She told them of the day she left, of the fear and the uncertainty that had gripped her, and how it was only through facing the pain that she had learned to heal. As she spoke, she felt the room grow quiet. The women around her didn't interrupt or judge. They simply listened, and as she finished her story, she saw something in their eyes, something she had never seen before in anyone else. Hope. It was the first time Grandma realized the power of sharing her story. Her vulnerability, her honesty, had connected with others in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that they empathized with her. It was that they saw themselves in her story. They saw their own struggles, their own fears, their own journeys toward healing reflected in her words. It was in that moment that Grandma understood that healing didn't just come from within. It came from connection, from seeing that you weren't alone in your pain. The impact of her story spread quickly throughout the community. Word of her honesty, her strength, and her willingness to share her experiences reached more and more people. Women began to approach her one by one, seeking advice, seeking guidance. They wanted to know how she had found the strength to overcome the darkness that had once consumed her. They wanted to know how to face their own demons, how to let go of the pain that had been keeping them trapped. And each time someone asked her to share more, she did. She taught them the lessons she had learned, that pain was not something to fear, but something to embrace, something that, when faced with courage, could lead to transformation. She showed them that healing was not a straight path, it was a journey of growth, of finding strength in the brokenness. Grandma began to realize that her own healing had not been just for her. It had been for others, too. Every person who came to her, every woman who found comfort in her words, was a reminder that pain could lead to purpose. Her story, once filled with sorrow, had become a source of inspiration, a symbol of what was possible when you chose to face your past instead of running from it. The more she shared, the more she realized that healing was a cyclical process. Her story gave others the strength to tell their own, and in turn, their stories gave her even more strength. It was as though they were all planting seeds in each other, creating a garden of healing that would continue to grow. Grandma learned that the act of sharing her pain was just as important as the healing itself. She wasn't just healing herself anymore. She was helping others heal too. In that, she found her purpose. It wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting the pain, but about using it to create something new, something beautiful, something full of hope. And so her story continued, not just as a memory of hardship, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of vulnerability, connection, and transformation. Each person who came to her was another piece of the puzzle, another opportunity to teach, to learn, and to grow. Through her own healing, Grandma had not only saved herself, she had become a beacon of hope for others, showing them that from pain, new life could grow. And in that, she found her true purpose, to help others heal, just as she had healed herself. Grandma had always been a quiet woman, one who kept her pain close to her chest, like a secret she feared to share. For most of her life, she had lived in silence, battling her demons alone, convinced that her struggles were hers alone to bear. But as the months turned into years, and as she found herself healing in ways she never thought possible, something within her began to change. She realized that her story was no longer something to hide. It was something to share. It was a warm afternoon when the idea first came to her. She had been working in her garden, the small plot of earth she had cultivated as her own space of peace and healing, when she overheard a conversation between two women from the town. They were talking about their struggles, one with the loss of a loved one, the other with an abusive relationship. Grandma, who had always kept to herself, paused for a moment, her hands still in the soil as she listened to their pain. She felt a deep empathy for them, a longing to reach out and offer the comfort she had learned to give herself. In that instant, she understood. Her pain had a purpose, and that purpose was not just her own healing. It was to help others, to show them that they too could heal. She had spent so many years buried in her own sorrow, but now she saw that her struggles could become a source of strength for others. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, or where to start, but she knew she had to begin. She had already started sharing small pieces of herself with those around her. The conversations with Mrs. Della, the quiet evenings with Mark, the stories she shared with the women who came to her for advice. Slowly, she began to open up, letting people see the woman she had become, not just the girl who had fled in fear. And with each person she spoke to, she felt the power of her words, the comfort they brought, and the healing that blossomed in others as well. The first time she shared her story in full was with a group of women at the community center. It wasn't a planned speech or a rehearsed monologue. It was simply her, sitting with a small group of women who had gathered to talk about their lives, their hardships, their dreams. As they spoke, Grandma listened, offering words of encouragement. But it wasn't until one of the women asked her, "How did you get through your pain?" that she found herself sharing. At first, the words came out haltingly, awkwardly, as though her story had been buried for so long that it didn't quite fit into the present. She spoke of her childhood, of the heavy grief that had suffocated her, and the way she had run from it, only to realize that running had only delayed the inevitable. She talked about the years spent in silence, the guilt that weighed her down, and the strength she had found within herself to break free. She told them of the day she left, of the fear and the uncertainty that had gripped her, and how it was only through facing the pain that she had learned to heal. As she spoke, she felt the room grow quiet. The women around her didn't interrupt or judge. They simply listened, and as she finished her story, she saw something in their eyes, something she had never seen before in anyone else. Hope. It was the first time Grandma realized the power of sharing her story. Her vulnerability, her honesty, had connected with others in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that they empathized with her. It was that they saw themselves in her story. They saw their own struggles, their own fears, their own journeys toward healing reflected in her words. It was in that moment that Grandma understood that healing didn't just come from within. It came from connection, from seeing that you weren't alone in your pain. The impact of her story spread quickly throughout the community. Word of her honesty, her strength, and her willingness to share her experiences reached more and more people. Women began to approach her one by one, seeking advice, seeking guidance. They wanted to know how she had found the strength to overcome the darkness that had once consumed her. They wanted to know how to face their own demons, how to let go of the pain that had been keeping them trapped. And each time someone asked her to share more, she did. She taught them the lessons she had learned, that pain was not something to fear, but something to embrace, something that, when faced with courage, could lead to transformation. She showed them that healing was not a straight path. It was a journey of growth, of finding strength in the brokenness. Grandma began to realize that her own healing had not been just for her. It had been for others, too. Every person who came to her, every woman who found comfort in her words, was a reminder that pain could lead to purpose. Her story, once filled with sorrow, had become a source of inspiration, a symbol of what was possible when you chose to face your past instead of running from it. The more she shared, the more she realized that healing was a cyclical process. Her story gave others the strength to tell their own, and in turn, their stories gave her even more strength. It was as though they were all planting seeds in each other, creating a garden of healing that would continue to grow. Grandma learned that the act of sharing her pain was just as important as the healing itself. She wasn't just healing herself anymore. She was helping others heal too. In that, she found her purpose. It wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting the pain, but about using it to create something new, something beautiful, something full of hope. And so her story continued, not just as a memory of hardship, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of vulnerability, connection, and transformation. Each person who came to her was another piece of the puzzle, another opportunity to teach, to learn, and to grow. Through her own healing, Grandma had not only saved herself, she had become a beacon of hope for others, showing them that from pain, new life could grow. And in that, she found her true purpose, to help others heal, just as she had healed herself. Grandma sat on her porch, the sun casting a golden glow across the fields in front of her. It was a quiet evening, the kind that always felt like a breath of fresh air after a long, hard day. The gentle rustle of the leaves in the trees and the distant hum of crickets filled the air, creating a sense of stillness that she had come to cherish. In these moments, she could finally breathe without the weight of the past pressing down on her chest. It had taken years to get here, to this place of peace, to this place of self-acceptance. The journey from the frightened girl who had once run from her pain to the woman she had become was not an easy one. But as she looked back now, she realized that it was exactly the journey she needed to take. Her struggles, her losses, her moments of doubt, they had all led her to this moment of clarity. Her pain had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. It was no longer the first thing people saw when they looked at her. Instead, What they saw now was a woman who had not only survived, but had turned her scars into wisdom, her wounds into strength. She had come to understand that her past was not a burden. It was the foundation of the person she had become. A person who had learned to rise again, no matter how many times life knocked her down. There was a quiet joy in her life now, a joy that came from knowing that she had done the hard work, both emotionally and spiritually, of healing herself. She no longer felt trapped by the chains of her past. The fears, the doubts, the guilt, they had all faded away, replaced by a sense of freedom that she had never thought possible. The past was still there, but it was no longer the shadow that loomed over her every move. She had made peace with it. Now she lived her life with purpose. Every day felt like a new opportunity to grow, to help others, to make the world just a little bit brighter. She had learned that healing wasn't just about fixing yourself. It was about living fully, embracing the present, and using your own journey to light the way for others. Her story, once a painful secret, had become a beacon of hope for those around her. Grandma had long since stopped living in fear of the past. The choices she had made to leave, to forgive, to heal, they were all acts of strength. She understood now that in facing her pain, she had found her true self, the woman she was always meant to be, the woman she could have been had she not been weighed down by years of doubt and fear. She smiled to herself as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, a peaceful satisfaction settling over her. This was her life now, and it was a life she was proud to live. She was no longer the woman who had been afraid to stand up for herself. She was no longer the woman who had hidden from her past. She was a woman who had taken ownership of her story, who had turned her pain into power, and now she was teaching others to do the same. Her days were spent helping those who came to her for guidance, friends, strangers, and even those who had once been lost in their own suffering, just as she had been. She didn't have all the answers, but she had compassion, and that was often enough. Her story, her vulnerability, became a source of strength for others, just as it had been for her. She had become a mentor, a guide for those who needed it most. The women she met, the people who crossed her path, could see the peace in her eyes and hear the calm in her voice. They could feel that she had something real to offer, something they could hold on to as they tried to find their own way out of their struggles. Her journey had given her the wisdom to show them theirs. As the years went by, Grandma continued to live her life with purpose. She tended to her garden, shared her quilts with those in need, and offered her support to anyone who needed it. She had found fulfillment in the simple things that once seemed so insignificant, but now felt like the foundation of a life well lived. She knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, and the best part was, she knew that it was never too late to change. Her own transformation was proof of that. It was never too late to heal, never too late to rewrite your story, to reclaim the parts of yourself you thought you had lost. She had started her journey at a time when it seemed like everything was falling apart, when the world felt like it was closing in on her. But now, with every day that passed, she realized that it wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. She had found peace within herself, but more than that, she had found purpose. Her life, with all its ups and downs, had led her to this moment, a moment where she could say without hesitation that she had lived fully. She had learned that the power to heal, to change and to find joy was always within her, and now it was something she shared with the world around her. As she sat on her porch, looking out at the land that had once seemed like a prison, she saw it for what it truly was, a place of freedom, a place where she had built her new life from the ground up. The sun had set, the stars were beginning to appear, and Grandma knew that the night held no fear for her anymore. The darkness no longer had power over her, for she had learned to walk in the light, And in that peace, in that quiet joy, she realized that the best part of her journey was the one she had yet to take. As the years passed, Grandma's life unfolded into something far more beautiful than she could have ever imagined during the darkest days of her past. What had once seemed like a quiet, ordinary life became a testament to the power of resilience, love, and transformation. Her journey from pain to healing became her legacy, and that legacy, in turn, began to touch the lives of those around her in ways she had never anticipated. Grandma's transformation did not just affect her own life. It rippled out into her family, her community, and beyond, like a stone cast into still water, sending waves of change far and wide. Her family was the first to feel the impact. Her children, who had grown up witnessing her struggles, began to see her in a new light. They had always loved her, but now they admired her in ways they hadn't before. They saw the woman she had become, strong, confident, and full of purpose, and realized that her journey had shaped them in ways they hadn't fully understood. Her son, who had grown up under the shadow of her pain, often found himself reflecting on how her strength had influenced him. He would share stories of her courage with his own children, telling them how their grandmother had not only survived the hardest of times, but had used her experiences to help others. He wanted them to understand that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you cultivate through life's struggles. Her daughter, too, was deeply moved by the changes she saw in her mother. She had witnessed her mother's silence, her mother's suffering, and had often felt helpless in the face of it. But as an adult, watching Grandma take ownership of her past and transform it into something empowering was a revelation. Grandma had taught her that it was okay to embrace vulnerability and that sharing one's story wasn't a weakness. It was a source of strength. Even her grandchildren began to understand the depth of Grandma's wisdom. They loved hearing her stories of a time when things seemed impossible, but where hope was always found in the smallest of victories. Grandma had become their hero, not because of her perfection, but because of her humanity. She had shown them that it wasn't the obstacles in life that defined you. It was how you chose to overcome them. Her wisdom became a part of her family's fabric, passed down from generation to generation. They no longer saw Grandma's past as a story of loss, but as a story of healing, a story of finding peace amidst chaos, strength amidst weakness, and hope amidst despair. But Grandma's legacy didn't stop at her family. The ripples of her transformation began to spread throughout her community. Over the years, she became known as a source of strength for those who were struggling. Women came to her for advice, not just about surviving their hardships, but about embracing their own journeys of healing. She listened without judgment, offered words of wisdom, and shared the lessons she had learned. Grandma knew that healing wasn't something that could be done alone. It had to be a communal effort. And so she created a space for others to share their stories, to confront their pain, and to find hope in each other. Her story of survival became a blueprint for others, a shining example of how it was possible to take the broken pieces of your life and build something meaningful with them. She didn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. What she offered was a reminder that the path to healing was never linear, but it was always worth walking. At the community center, where she had once shared her own story with a small group of women, she now led support groups, helped others write their own stories, and taught them to embrace their vulnerability as a source of strength. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving despite the odds, about living fully in the aftermath of pain. One of the most profound moments for Grandma came when she saw a woman in the group she led for the first time. A woman who had lived through an abusive relationship, who had carried years of trauma with her, and who felt like she could never move forward. The woman shared her story with the group, hesitantly at first, but with growing confidence. And as the group listened, something shifted. The woman's fear, her shame, melted away in the presence of understanding. She was no longer just a victim of her past. She was a survivor. After the meeting, the woman approached Grandma, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I could ever speak of it, but you made me feel like my story mattered." Grandma smiled, gently placing her hand on the woman's shoulder. "Your story always mattered," she said softly. In that moment, Grandma knew that her journey had come full circle. Her life, filled with its own struggles and triumphs, had now become a source of healing for others. Her story had taught others that healing was possible, that no matter the depth of the pain, it was always possible to find a way to heal, grow, and live with purpose. She had turned her own suffering into a tool for helping others, showing them that no matter where you start, you can always rise above it. As she reflected on her life, Grandma realized that the most powerful legacy she could leave was not in the material things she had, but in the way she had lived her truth. She had faced her fears, embraced her vulnerability, and shown others that pain could lead to transformation. From that transformation, they could find their own purpose, just as she had found hers. Her life had become a story of hope and strength, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always the possibility of finding light. It wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about learning to live through it, and in doing so, helping others to do the same. Grandma had left behind a legacy that would live on long after she was gone. A legacy of courage, compassion, and the unshakable belief that it's never too late to change. She had shown her family, her community, and the world that no matter how difficult the journey, there was always the potential for renewal, for growth, and for healing, and that was the legacy she had always hoped to leave behind. Grandma's journey was never easy. It was a path filled with pain, loss, and struggle, but it was also a path of transformation. From the young girl trapped in the shadows of her past, to the woman who found her strength, courage, and purpose, her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It shows that no matter where you start, no matter how difficult the circumstances, you always have the power to rewrite your own story. Throughout her life, Grandma faced countless obstacles, family turmoil, personal heartbreak, and the weight of her own guilt, but she didn't let those challenges define her. Instead, she used them as stepping stones, as fuel to push forward. She learned that the pain of the past doesn't have to be a life sentence. In fact, it can be the very thing that drives us toward our own rebirth. Grandma's story is a reminder that no one is ever truly stuck. No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how deep the scars, you have the ability to rise, to heal, and to transform. You don't have to stay in the same place, held hostage by your past. You don't have to be defined by the pain you've endured. You can create a new chapter for yourself, one that's filled with purpose, peace, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Just like Grandma, you have the strength within you to overcome your struggles. You have the power to change the narrative of your life. Healing is possible, and it starts with the decision to take that first step, whether it's facing your fears, forgiving yourself, or simply choosing to keep moving forward. It's never too late to begin, and it's never too late to change. If Grandma's story has touched you in any way, know that her journey is a reflection of what's possible for you too. Your pain doesn't define you. It's simply a part of the story that you can rewrite. You have the ability to find your own path to healing, to create a life that aligns with the person you truly are. So, take a moment today and reflect on your own struggles. What has held you back? What pain have you been carrying? Imagine a life where that pain no longer controls you, where you no longer feel stuck in the past. What would it feel like to take control, to begin healing, and to move forward? The power to change is in your hands. Grandma didn't wait for permission to heal. She didn't wait for everything to be perfect. She took action even when it felt impossible. And you can too. If you've been moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story isn't just hers, it's yours too. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know how your story, your journey, might inspire someone else to take that first step toward their own transformation. You have the power to heal, to change, and to rise above. It's time to start writing your own story. The world is waiting for the next chapter of your life.